Good evening and welcome to another edition of Down to the Wire. I'm your host, dermatologist, and joining me again this week is co-host Capping with Candace. Candace here. Candace, this week we're going to try to get a variety of races in as we're kind of in an off week of our Derby preparations. We're going to take a look at the turf race from Keeneland, and then we also have a synthetic race from Woodbine, the Whimsical, and then we'll cap it off with the Illinois Derby for 3-year-olds at Hawthorne. But first off, 1.5 miles on the turf at Keeneland. And kind of these older turf divisions seems to be dominated by 5, 6, and 7-year-olds even.
They really do. And when I first looked at this race, I thought this was a really interesting field in that we have some here cutting back from that 2-mile race. We have some of the older horses who, just still are competitive. And then we have a few of the younger horses who we haven't seen in a while, like Java's Wars. But in this spot, I'm really keen on Biz the Nurse. He's only ran here one time in America so far. Was a Group 1 winner over 1.5 miles in Italy, and I really liked that one run of his that he had here. That was at Gulfstream over 1 mile and 7/16. Won it pretty well, even though he started off slow there. I think here now, just that little bit of a stretch out, another 1/16 of a mile is absolutely a good thing for him, and I wouldn't expect him to be so far back. Breaking slow isn't super typical of him, so I expect him to be a little bit more in touch early on. Has a nice work time coming in here as well, and he was one I kind of had, very high expectations for when he came to America initially, just because of his success in Italy. Loves the firm turf, so I'm going to go with Biz the Nurse in this spot.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting race. Keeneland has the 1.5 mile turf race in the spring and in the fall, and last year Unitarian won the spring version, and then Holiday Star won the Sycamore, which is the fall version. That was a nice win. I thought Unitarian got that pace was a little tricky the last time, but at the end he kind of ended up pulling away. Do you think he's informed to run a good race, or?
I think my concern for him would be the cutback. I thought that last race was weird in that I thought that the jockeys went way too fast for a 2-mile race early on, and he kind of took advantage of that, and he finished very strongly. But I wonder if, now having stretched him all the way out to 2 miles, if this will prove to be a little bit sharp for him. I expect him to be in it, closing late. Whether or not he gets there in time, though, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, I ended up taking a look at a couple of horses. Prairie Street, he got that insane pace to run into in the Las Vegas Marathon, and this is his first race off the layoff, so I think they're kind of just rounding him into form, and this is a good race for that. I ended up going with Dynamic Sky just because of the class drop. Finnegan's Wake, he kind of got a little bit, or at least started dominating races that he should win, and I'm not sure he really improved, but at least Dynamic Sky has some of that form class. I kind of agree with you. Sometimes that 2 mile back to 1.5 miles is kind of tricky. I do expect Unitarian to run well because he does seem to have good form, and he never really puts in a clunker. I couldn't really find the pace setter in this race. So I'm hoping Dynamic Sky can lay 3-4 lengths off that pace and then maybe just kind of outfinish Unitarian is what I'm hoping on.
Yeah, I think that's maybe the tricky part here is if nobody goes forward, I would think maybe Dramedy from the Rail, though he doesn't show a ton of speed, but maybe he shows more than some of these. If we don't have somebody go forward, then yeah, that's probably what Unitarian absolutely would want, because he certainly has the sharpest turn of foot in the field.
And Holiday Star seems to have some good workouts, and Graham Motion is capable of getting a horse to win off the layoff. One thing I noticed with him, he seems to kind of dominate some of those 5 and 6 horse fields, and then a bigger field he doesn't seem to have quite the racing luck, I guess.
Yeah, that's absolutely what I've noticed with him as well. I think, a lot of times in these bigger fields he can struggle, whereas in the smaller fields you can kind of send him forward, and maybe he's just the class of some of those fields that can take advantage.
Well, I think everybody kind of enjoys these longer races. The weather's been nice at Keeneland, so hopefully we don't get any scratches, and you're going with the Euro Shipper, and I'm kind of taking Dynamic Sky a little bit on the drop, but we'll have to see how the odds play out in that race. Mm-hmm. Now, the Whimsical is a synthetic race, 6 furlongs. Woodbine at the beginning of the meet is always tough because they card some of these shorter stakes races, but it's kind of where you can kind of see form cycles of horses that like to win that are well more meant off the layoff, and then some need races to kind of get into shape.
Yeah, that's what I felt like was the key to this race was, you know, trying to figure out which horses are momentum in the spot, which trainers do well here off of these long layoffs that most of them are coming off of since we're at the start of the meet. I think there's a little bit of speed in here with a few of these, but I ended up going with one of those speed horses, an Executive Allure. This is a horse who, compared to some of these, is lightly raised. It hasn't quite been around as some of the others in this race, but finished off the season strong, won two in a row. A horse who seems like she tends to do well fresh for a trainer who does decent enough off of long layoffs as well. So Executive Allure, I think this is her type of race, whereas there was a few in here I got the feeling that they really went further and that this race is purely a prep for them. Breaking from the far outside, I think she's definitely going to be sent to the lead, and it's going to be a matter of whether or not she can hold it. But Executive Allure, I think, for me in this type of a race, is one who kind of checks all the boxes.
Yeah, I got it down pretty quickly to Executive Allure and Unspurned. And I agree with you, by the end of last year, Executive Allure was clearly better than Unspurned, but I noticed last year, early on in May, Unspurned had a nice win. And I just like Leparoux. I like, not Leparoux, but I like the Lemon Drop Kid,
Uh-oh.
synthetic breeding. And a couple of his better races were near the front. And I just think that maybe she can turn the tables on Executive Allure. But there's a couple of other horses that I thought maybe, they look like they're getting ready for longer races.
Yeah, that's how I felt looking at it. And so yeah, I'm sure it'll prove to be an interesting race going forward. One of these that, even aside from choosing the winner, will probably be a good one to pay attention to some of these horses who are finishing the race strongly, and make note of them about when they show up again, probably over a further distance.
And sometimes what happens in these synthetic sprints is they all kind of just line up and it just becomes a quarter-mile dash down the stretch, where that's why a horse like Executive Allure can win off the layoff, just because they've got a little bit of that quick turn of foot, and they really don't need to run six. They just kind of hang around and then just run the final quarter.
Yeah, and always, I know we talked about it for Gulfstream, but I always think with the synthetic tracks in particular, if you're playing them to, it's always nice wherever you're playing to pay attention to the races on the undercard, but I always think it's a little more, even more important on these synthetic tracks because, you can get maybe a little bit more extreme biases one way or the other, so of course you want to make note of that before you get to this 8th race if you can.
Hawthorne, the Illinois Derby, it's a competitive race this year. I mean, I really took a look at each of the contenders, and I think we've got a couple of horses that might be able to set the pace, and kind of how do you see the race?
Yeah, when I looked at this race, I agree. I think it's competitive. Even the horses who I think we'd expect to be favorite, we have a morning line now. We didn't have that like an hour ago. The morning line here has Whiskey Ticket 7-2, Cross the Line 3-1. I wouldn't be surprised if those two went off in reverse order by the time the post time comes, just because of the Baffert factor. On Whiskey Ticket, both of them, I think there's questions. Cross the Line, as much as I like him as a horse and I don't mind him on dirt, this could be a little bit too far for him. I think distance is a legitimate concern. Whiskey Ticket hasn't even ran against winners, so that would be a concern for him as well. He projects as the speed to me. I think he goes forward and plays a little bit of catch me if you can in this type of a spot. Ultimately, I ended up siding with Phenomenal Phoenix here. Bank just banking on that cross the line doesn't stay. I think he clearly is the class of this field, but I'm not sure so much at this distance. I liked Phenomenal Phoenix's allowance race. I think he'll be able to sit in a really nice spot just off of that speed set by Whiskey Ticket. When you look at Phenomenal Phoenix's past performances, he has a couple really bad races over wet tracks. You take those out, and he's actually very consistent and looks every bit, a kind of improving type. And, I know his trainer's been struggling a little bit as of late, but I think this is a spot where, he absolutely fits, and he's one who I'm not worried about stretching out this far. So I'm going to go with Phenomenal Phoenix here at a little bit of a price.
One of the horses I want to talk about before we go into my selection was, did you have a chance to look at that Lewis Vaporizer at all? This horse is an Illinois bred, and normally it's kind of a toss-up, but it's a sharp Illinois trainer, Larry Ravelli. And I think what people are going to fail to realize is, he had that race last May, and he was bet down to 4-1, and he lost by 18 lengths. But that's a whole different form cycle than coming back in March 27th. It was a 6-horse field, but I mean, a 111 at Hawthorne, and he got a 90 speed rating, and he won by 11. Like, I think this horse is just going to be sharp, and I think too many people are going to factor in that 18th loss as a May 2-year-old, and I just don't think that has anything to do with his current talent.
Yeah, and I think maybe he was the type who he needed some of that time off to mature. If you remember that debut race, he had a lot of trouble at the start. He was extremely green. So maybe he just needed a little bit of time to kind of mature into himself mentally. I agree that his maiden win was very sharp. And you know, if you're looking to bet against a horse like Whiskey Ticket, maybe you think Louis Vaporizer goes up there and kind of messes with him a little bit.
Yeah, I think Whiskey Ticket will take a lot of money, and this is one of those horses that I'm totally anti against. The old wedding funeral. I mean, I think if you missed the wedding the last time at 15-1, don't go to the funeral at 7-2 here. And you know, it's got some nice breeding, but with the connections and the win at Santa Anita, like, it's just going to take a lot of money. But yeah, Santa Anita had some nice, good horses on the West Coast this year, and they've definitely got some classy horses. But by the time we got to March, those races weren't that much better. So I'm tossing Whiskey Ticket completely. I think Vaporizer has enough speed to kind of burn them out. And I just think the ship and whatever's going to kind of do Whiskey Ticket in. The horses I ended up getting down to was either Conquest Curlinate, who I thought he had a nice race against Poseidon's Way the last time, and he kind of grinded out a maiden victory 2 races back. Again, nothing visually impressive, but just kind of the way he did it. Like, you just kind of get the feeling that he'd like 9 furlongs. Ultimately, I ended up going with Cross the Line. At first, I was kind of anti this horse, but then I kind of started looking, you know, that Dortmund running line looms large. Like, that, he ran, I mean, he was never in the race, but he was never out of the race. And I mean, Dortmund would just outclass some of these horses by 10, 15 lengths. That's not as bad of a race. He had kind of I don't know if it was a bad trip. I just thought maybe
It was a really weird trip last time out.
Yeah, and then, you know, on that synthetic race against Metaboss, they got it. I like the jockey switch here, Florent Giroux, and I think he might actually, this might be one of those 7-2 horses that might stay at 7-2 and might actually be a good win bet for $9. I do like Phenomenal Phoenix a lot because I agree with you 100%. You throw out the 2 muddy races and you got 3 nice races. You got a 5-length win, a loss to instant replay, and then a nice win against Cantoon. And I don't think Cantoon is that much of a stretch in this race as well to get maybe 3rd or 4th.
Yeah, Cantoon is one of those who, I know we talked about it with a Phillies race recently where there's that horse that kind of just always wins their race every time and is kind of a good barometer. And I think that's how Cantoon is in these kinds of spots. Like, he's going to run his race every time, and it kind of gives us a little bit of indication to the strength of the field afterwards. And yeah, I mean, I'm not going to bet him in the spot, but I don't think there's a lot of other horses in here that I think it would have a much more difficult time making a case for. I crossed the line. I can't fault you there. Like I said, I think he's the clear class of the field. It's just a matter of whether or not he stays. But I'm interested that you said you loved Conquest Curlinate's race last time out, because I absolutely hated it. I was extremely disappointed last time out. I thought he just finished with nothing. Like, he loomed up like he was going to do something and just completely flattened out for no explanation that I could find.
Well, I mean, he did flatten out after making that move, but Poseidon's Way is, I mean, a listed a stakes type horse.
Yeah.
Maybe he just made his rally a little bit too soon. The same jockey stays on him. That'll be the 3rd trip in a row. You know, his race at Woodbine last fall was kind of you can kind of make the case where he could go either, like, his 1 win could be the outlier, or those 2 other races might be more of the indicator that he's just kind of a flatliner.
Yeah, that's always the gamble with these kind of lightly raced types.
You know, 2 other things to note. You know, we've been talking about kind of some of the smaller fields, but, you know, Cantoon, I think, is perfectly kind of a trifecta superfecta horse. He's ran 9 races. 8 of those races, he's had 10 or more horse fields. And then even the horse that you like, Phenomenal Phoenix, he's ran 6 races, and all 6 races, 3 of them 11 horse fields and 3 of them 10 horse fields. So I do think that does play a role, and you know, sometimes even horses can run 5th, 6th, 7th in those races. At least they're kind of getting used to running around horses and hearing some other hooves on the track versus, you know, a horse, you know, that just kind of went to the lead and like Whiskey Ticket, I just don't think has faced any adversity, and now has got to face some other, at least some sharp speed. And even Private Prospect has no form this year, but last year he actually ran a few decent races. So I don't know what's up with Private Prospect. I can't really make a case for him off those last two races.
No, I couldn't. I mean, he's kind of like how we talked about Tisna or Jay last week. That it was just he. It just seems like he's fallen off form, and there's no explanation as to why that I can find. So I couldn't touch him in this spot.
Yeah, we were right about that one. Tisno RJ is
That
still
was
off.
bad.
So that's going to do it for another edition of Down to the Wire. Make sure to join us next week as we have a special Kentucky Derby preview. And then in 2 weeks, we'll be taking a look at some of our final bankroll plays and Oaks, Derby, and Woodford selections. For Capping with Candace, I'm Derbyologist on Down to the Wire.